The sky above Veldara Prime fractured like a mirror struck by a hammer, and in that instant, every human soul on the planet felt the breath leave their lungs as if the universe itself had inhaled. The ground trembled with a rhythm older than stars, a pulse that resonated not through stone or steel, but through the marrow of reality itself. For 3 generations, the agri-world had turned its crops beneath a sun that burned honest and warm, its people ignorant of the crypt that slept beneath their fields, a tomb where gods of living metal dreamed nightmares of conquest and annihilation. Now those dreams ended, and the awakening began, not with the scream of bolters or the thunder of orbital bombardment, but with silence, a silence so profound it devoured sound itself, leaving only the crystalline hum of ancient machinery stirring after 60 million years of slumber. The farmers looked up from their fields, their hands still stained with soil that had never known the touch of death, and saw the monoliths rising from the earth like teeth erupting from a wound, black stone etched with glyphs that hurt to perceive, symbols that spoke in a language predating human consciousness. Children dropped their toys, their laughter dying in throats suddenly tight with primal terror, while their parents reached for hunting rifles and agri-tools, weapons laughably inadequate against what emerged from below. The local PDF garrison, 30,000 men and women who had trained for orc raids and pirate incursions, felt their tactical doctrine shatter as green lightning split the horizon and warriors of impossible geometry stepped from nothing, their Gauss flares already whining with the promise of molecular disintegration. This was no invasion, no conquest in any human understanding of the term. This was reclamation, the rightful owners returning to a property they had vacated before mankind's ancestors learned to kindle fire, and every human on Veldara Prime stood as squatters in a house whose true masters had finally come home. But before we witness the horror of what comes next, if you're ready to dive deep into the grim darkness of the far future, hit that like button, share this video with your fellow lore seekers, and subscribe because we're about to explore one of the most terrifying scenarios in Warhammer 40K, the awakening of the Necrons on a human world, told not through distant reports but through the eyes of those who lived it, fought it, and died screaming into the uncaring void. The tremors began on a Tuesday morning, though no one on Veldara Prime thought to mark the day as anything other than ordinary until much later, when survivors would try to piece together the timeline of their annihilation and realize the signs had been screaming at them for weeks. Old Karn, a farmer whose family had worked the northern plateaus for 5 generations, felt it first as he guided his thresher across fields of golden wheat grain, a vibration that traveled up through the machine's treads and into his bones, not the familiar rumble of tectonic adjustment but something rhythmic and purposeful, like the heartbeat of something vast stirring beneath kilometers of planetary crust. He killed the engine and stepped down onto soil that had always felt solid, finding it somehow wrong under his boots, not softer or harder but different in a way his mind refused to process, as though the fundamental nature of matter itself had shifted by degrees too subtle for conscious recognition but profound enough to trigger every instinct evolution had bred into humanity for surviving things that wanted to kill them. His hands, weathered by decades of honest labor, began to shake, and he told himself it was the morning chill even as sweat broke cold across his spine, his body responding to stimuli his rational mind had not yet accepted. In the capital city of Sancta Majoris, 300 kilometers south of Karn's farm, tech priest explorator Venko stood in the primary generatorum chamber watching readouts that made no sense according to any principle of the Omnissia's sacred laws. The plasma reactors that powered the city's grid were operating at 97% efficiency, well within acceptable parameters, yet electromagnetic sensors scattered across the continental plates registered flux patterns that suggested massive power draws occurring kilometers underground, in geological strata that Imperial surveys had certified as solid bedrock containing nothing but mineral deposits of negligible value. Venko's mechadendrites twitched with agitation as they interfaced with the monitoring cogitators, his augmented consciousness parsing data streams that formed geometric progressions too perfect to be natural, mathematical relationships that spoke of deliberate engineering on a scale that dwarfed anything the Imperium had constructed on this world. He filed reports that vanished into the bureaucratic machinery of the administratum, his concerns tagged as low-priority anomalies requiring investigation within the next fiscal quarter, a timeline that would prove cosmically inadequate when measured against the countdown already underway in crypts that had been calculating their awakening protocols since before Terra's sun ignited. The children were the first to truly understand, though they lacked the language to articulate what they knew. In the Skolam facilities scattered across Veldara Prime's 17 major settlements, teachers reported unprecedented behavioral changes, students as young as 6 refusing to enter certain classrooms, claiming the walls felt wrong, that they could hear whispers in languages that hurt their ears, sounds that came not through the air but directly into their minds like cold fingers pressing against the interior of their skulls. The planetary governor's daughter, a girl named Elia who had just celebrated her 8th birthday, began drawing pictures that made her tutors uncomfortable, images of skeletal figures with glowing eyes standing in geometric formations that seemed to shift and reorganize when viewed peripherally. And when her father demanded to know where she had seen such things, she told him they visited her dreams every night, standing at the foot of her bed, watching her with the patience of mountains, waiting for something she could not name, but which filled her with a terror so profound she had learned to sleep with her eyes open, afraid that closing them would somehow give the skeletal figures permission to step from nightmare into waking reality. The astropaths knew, of course, but astropaths always know things that kill them slowly from the inside out, and Veldara Prime's choir of sanctioned psychers had learned long ago that some knowledge was better swallowed than spoken. They felt it as pressure building in the Imperium, not the chaotic turbulence of warp storms, but something different, a smoothness that was somehow worse, as though reality in the space around Veldara Prime was being pressed flat by an enormous weight, dimensions compressing until the barrier between materium and immaterium grew thin as parchment, and through that thinness seeped a cold that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the absence of life, of warmth, of the vital energy that sustained organic existence. 3 astropaths died in the span of a week, their bodies found in their sanctums with expressions of such profound horror that the medici attendants who examined them required counseling afterward, and the choirmaster, an ancient woman named Severina who had served the Emperor's will for 97 years, sealed herself in her chamber and began transmitting warnings that she knew would arrive too late, her psychic voice screaming across the void with the desperation of a woman who had seen the shape of the future and found it filled with nothing but green lightning and the cold mathematics of extinction. The sinkholes appeared next, vast circular depressions that opened overnight in patterns that formed perfect geometric arrays when viewed from orbit, shapes that conformed to mathematical principles human science had yet to discover, arrangements that suggested purpose and intelligence operating on planetary scales. Governor Valen Cormand authorized excavation teams to investigate the northernmost sinkhole, a perfectly circular pit 700 meters in diameter that had swallowed an entire farming commune, buildings and all, leaving behind walls so smooth they appeared machined rather than naturally formed. The team descended on cable rigs, their Vox transmissions growing increasingly frantic as they reported structures in the depths, architecture of black stone etched with glyphs that seemed to writhe and reconfigure when observed directly, corridors that extended into darkness so absolute their lumens couldn't penetrate more than a few meters, and a cold that made their breath freeze solid before it left their lungs. The last transmission received before all contact ceased was a single sentence from the team leader, his voice stripped of all emotion save a flat certainty that was somehow more terrifying than panic. "They're not ruins, Governor, they're houses, and something's starting to turn on the lights." Valen Cormand locked the report in his personal safe and considered his options with the grim calculus of a man who understood he was dealing with something beyond his authority to handle, but which would destroy his career if he escalated prematurely. He was a bureaucrat, not a soldier, his position earned through decades of efficient grain quota management and strategic marriage alliances, and the decision matrix before him contained no good outcomes, only variations of disaster ranging from personal ruin to planetary catastrophe. He delayed, a choice that would haunt him through the brief remainder of his life, and while he delayed, the tremors grew stronger, animals across the planet began to sicken and die from no cause medici examinations could identify, and the ancient machinery buried beneath Veldara Prime's crust completed its diagnostic cycles and began the final countdown to full reactivation. Systems that had slept for 60 million years coming online with the inexorable precision of mechanisms designed by a civilization that had defeated death itself and had nothing but time to perfect their vengeance against a universe that had dared to continue existing in their absence. In the mining settlements of the southern asteroid range, where Veldara Prime's modest or extraction operations had carved into foothills that bordered the great equatorial desert, something impossible occurred that the administratum would later classify as mass hysteria, but which every survivor knew with bone-deep certainty was the simple truth of what they had witnessed. A drilling team punched through into a cavity that should not have existed according to geological surveys, their bore bit suddenly meeting no resistance and spinning free into empty space. And when they lowered cameras into the void, the feeds showed a chamber so vast its walls vanished beyond the range of their illumination, a space that could have swallowed Sancta Majoris entire with room to spare. Its floor covered in what the initial reports described as coffins before someone with more sense realized they were looking at stasis pods, millions of them, arranged in rows that extended to infinity in all directions, each pod containing a figure of skeletal metal that gleamed with a dull sheen of unknown alloys, and in every skull-like face burned eyes of emerald light that had just begun to flicker and wake. The drilling team leader, a man named Gregors who had spent 40 years opening the planet's skin to extract its wealth, stared at the monitor feeds with the expression of someone watching their own execution, his mind refusing to process the implications of what he saw even as his body betrayed him with trembling hands and a bladder that let go without conscious permission. His second-in-command, younger and less imaginally constrained by decades of routine, grabbed the voxcaster and began screaming warnings to anyone who would listen, his voice cracking with the strain of trying to convey the scale of what they had found, the sheer impossible magnitude of it, a tomb the size of a continent buried beneath everything they had built, and that tomb was opening, its occupants stirring with the slow inevitability of tides, unstoppable and utterly indifferent to the panic of the living organisms that had built their temporary civilizations atop the grave markers of gods. The response was predictable in its inadequacy. Adeptus Astartes were dispatched to investigate reports of public disorder, Medici teams prepared to treat what they assumed were cases of toxic gas exposure, and Governor Cormand finally began drafting the emergency astropathic messages that should have been sent weeks earlier, his words carefully chosen to convey urgency without admitting his own delays, a political calculation that death would soon render cosmically irrelevant. The planet's PDF commander, Castellan Dreveros, received briefings that made her blood run cold despite her decades of military training, intelligence reports that painted a picture of something vast and ancient stirring beneath their feet, and she began quietly moving forces into defensive positions around critical infrastructure while simultaneously requisitioning every weapon in the planetary arsenal, knowing with the instinct of a career soldier that whatever was coming would make her preparation look like a child building sandcastles before a tsunami. The priests in the Cathedral of the Emperor Ascendant felt it too, though they interpreted the signs through the lens of faith rather than geology or physics. The great golden Aquila that dominated the cathedral's nave began to tarnish despite the constant ministrations of the shrine serfs, black spots appearing on the sacred metal that no amount of polishing could remove, as though something was leaching the holiness from the icon itself, draining the emperor's light from the material plane. Candles guttered and died when there was no wind to extinguish them, and the sacred oils that had burned eternal in the sanctuary lamps began to congeal and darken, their flames sputtering with green sparks that hurt to look upon. Father Dominicus, a priest who had served the emperor faithfully for 6 decades, stood before the altar and felt, for the first time in his long life of devotion, the terrible possibility that faith might not be enough, that there existed in the universe forces so ancient and terrible that even the God Emperor's light could not reach them, and that humanity's dominion of the galaxy was not a divine mandate, but a brief interlude between epochs of darkness that had existed before mankind's birth, and would persist long after mankind's extinction. The final sign came in the form of light, green radiance that began to seep from the ground itself, glowing veins that traced through soil and stone in patterns that spread like infection, visible first only at night, but growing brighter with each passing hour until even the sun could not wash them away. Farmers reported that the luminescence killed anything organic it touched, crops withering to ash within seconds of contact, livestock convulsing and dying when the light reached their pastures, and one unfortunate soul who stepped directly on a glowing vein found his leg reduced to skeletal bone in the space of a heartbeat, the flesh simply unraveling into component atoms that scattered on winds that had begun to carry the scent of ozone and something else, something metallic and cold that tasted of tombs and the long silence of extinction. The people of Veldara Prime looked upon these signs and knew with the certainty of prey animals that the predator had arrived, that their time of peaceful ignorance was ending, and that what came next would be written in the annals of Imperial history not as a battle or even a war, but as the Awakening, the day when humanity learned that the galaxy they believed they ruled had never truly been theirs at all. merely borrowed from masters who had finally decided to reclaim their inheritance. The ground opened at dawn on the 17th day of the 9th month. Though the sun that rose that morning would set upon a world transformed beyond all recognition, its light falling upon monuments of alien geometry that had erupted from beneath the surface like teeth breaking through gums, black obelisks that towered kilometers into the atmosphere and hummed with power that made reality itself shudder and flex. Castellan Dreveros watched from her command post on the outskirts of Sancta Majoris as the northern horizon simply lifted, the ground bulging upward as though the planet itself was pregnant with something monstrous, soil and stone cascading away to reveal structures of black metal etched with glyphs that glowed green and malevolent. Architecture that hurt human eyes to perceive because its angles didn't conform to Euclidean geometry, corners that existed in more than 3 dimensions, and surfaces that reflected light in ways that suggested the materials existed partially outside normal spacetime. Her tactical displays exploded with contact markers, thousands of them appearing simultaneously across a front that stretched from equator to polar ice, not advancing from beyond the horizon, but simply materializing into existence as though they had always been there and humanity had merely lacked the senses to perceive them until this moment. The Necron warriors rose from crypts that unsealed with sounds like reality tearing, emerging into the light of a sun their civilizations had watched burn hot and young when humanity's ancestors were single-celled organisms drifting in primordial seas. They moved with fluid grace that was somehow more unsettling than any jerky mechanical motion could have been, each step perfectly balanced, each gesture economically precise, bodies of living metal that reconfigured on the fly to compensate for terrain, weapons integrating seamlessly with skeletal arms that telescoped and shifted, and in every skull socket burned eyes of emerald fire that held no emotion whatsoever, no rage or hatred or even hunger, just the cold assessment of exterminators, evaluating an infestation that required elimination. They did not charge or storm forward. They advanced with a steady inevitability of continental drift, a tide of skeletal warriors that moved in perfect synchronization, their footfalls creating a rhythm that resonated through the ground and into the bones of every human who heard it, a drumbeat that spoke of inevitability and the futility of resistance. The PDF opened fire when the Necrons reached the kill zones Dreveros had designated, sectors of open ground saturated with overlapping fields of fire from dug-in positions, every weapon they possessed pouring death into the advancing formations. Lost bolts struck necrodermis armor and splashed like water, their energies insufficient to meaningfully damage materials forged in technologies that predated the Imperium by epochs. Autocannon shells impacted with greater effect, occasionally shattering limbs or blowing holes through torsos, but the wounded Necrons simply phased out of existence, teleporting back to repair crypts where they would be restored and returned to combat within hours, while those too damaged to self-repair dissolved into clouds of metallic scarabs that swarmed across the battlefield consuming their own dead, recycling the raw materials into new warriors that materialized from the swarm clouds, like nightmares solidifying from smoke. The PDF troopers, men and women who had trained for conventional combat against orcs or human renegades, felt their doctrine shatter as they poured magazine after magazine into targets that refused to die, that kept advancing despite damage that should have dropped anything made of meat and bone, and the realization spread through the ranks like a virus of despair that they were not fighting an enemy but a force of nature, a phenomenon as unstoppable as gravity or entropy. The Necron Gauss weaponry answered with green lightning that unmade matter at the molecular level, beams that didn't burn or pierce but simply caused whatever they touched to cease existing in any coherent form, flesh and bone and ceramite all reducing to glowing atoms that scattered on winds suddenly bereft of warmth. A trooper named Kev stood in his trench watching his squad mate disintegrate, the man's scream cutting off mid-breath as the Gauss beam touched his chest and worked outward, armor and flesh unraveling like thread pulled from a tapestry, leaving behind a skeleton that stood for one impossible moment before it too dissolved into green-lit ash. Kev tried to return fire and found his hands wouldn't obey. His mind unable to process the fundamental wrongness of what he was witnessing, combat stims in his bloodstream warring with pure terror for control of his nervous system, and he stood frozen until a sergeant grabbed him and dragged him back into the command bunker, both of them knowing retreat was just delaying the inevitable but unable to surrender without trying because humanity's greatest strength and most terrible curse has always been the refusal to accept extinction with grace. Above Sancta Majoris, reality tore open as Necron vessels translated into real space, not emerging from warp jumps, but simply existing there as though they had always occupied those coordinates and the universe was only now noticing them. They were not ships in any human understanding of the term. They were monuments to impossibility, pyramidal structures kilometers long that obeyed no known laws of physics, maintaining stable orbits despite masses that should have caused their own collapse, their black hulls etched with the same glyphs that covered the surface structures, and from their flanks extended weapons that began to speak. Not with the crude projectiles or energy beams of Imperial technology, but with focused, gravitational lenses that reached down through atmosphere to crush fortifications like insects beneath a boot, with particle beams that didn't explode or burn, but which caused matter to undergo state changes at the quantum level, stone flowing like water and then freezing into new configurations that formed ramps and bridges for the advancing ground forces. Defensive walls transforming into smooth roads that the Necrons walked across with the casual contempt of landlords remodeling a property they had temporarily vacated. Dreveros activated the distress beacon knowing it was too late. The astropathic message already sent weeks ago now crawling through the warp at speeds that made interstellar aid a fantasy rather than hope. But she activated it anyway because duty demanded the gesture even when the gesture was meaningless. Her command staff looked at her with eyes that held no expectation of survival, only the grim determination to sell their lives as expensively as possible, and she loved them for it even as she hated herself for leading them to this slaughter, for not seeing the signs sooner, for not acting when action might have saved something rather than now when action could only postpone the inevitable. The tactical displays showed Sancta Majori surrounded, the Necrons advancing from all quadrants with the synchronized precision of a closing fist, defensive lines collapsing not from cowardice, but from the simple mathematical reality that you cannot hold ground against an enemy that resurrects faster than you can kill them, that phases through obstacles and reforms behind your positions, that needs no supply lines or rest or morale because they are not alive in any sense that makes those concepts meaningful. In the civilian zones, panic had metastasized from fear into something primal and self-destructive, riots breaking out as millions tried to evacuate a planet that had nowhere to evacuate to, the spaceports overwhelmed by crowds that crushed their own children in the desperate scramble for ships that couldn't possibly carry them all, shuttles overloading and crashing because terrified pilots tried to fly with 3 times safe capacity. And in the streets, people tore at each other like animals. Because when death becomes certain, the social contracts that bind civilization dissolve, and what remains is raw survival instinct divorced from mercy or reason. Governor Cormand tried to restore order through Vox broadcasts that promised rescue was coming, that the Emperor's servants would deliver them from this nightmare, lies he told with the smooth confidence of a career politician even as he watched from his spire windows the green lightning dancing across the city below, buildings collapsing into themselves as Necron weapons restructured their molecular bonds, turning Habblocks into abstract sculptures of fused ceramite and pleading statuary that had been people seconds before the beams touched them. Father Dominicus stood in his cathedral as the doors burst inward and civilians flooded the nave seeking sanctuary that stone and faith could not provide against an enemy that predated the Emperor's birth and cared nothing for the symbols humanity held sacred. He led them in prayer anyway, his voice rising strong despite the trembling of his hands, the litanies of protection and deliverance flowing from lips that knew the words would change nothing but spoke them regardless, because sometimes faith is not about efficacy but about maintaining humanity in the face of inhuman forces, about refusing to become animals even when the universe treats you as such. The civilians joined him, thousands of voices rising in desperate harmony, and perhaps in that moment they touched something genuine in the warp, a flicker of the Emperor's light reaching across impossible distances to acknowledge their devotion even if it could not save them from what was coming, or perhaps it was just the shared delusion of dying organisms clinging to hope because the alternative was madness. But either way they sang and they prayed, and when the Necron warriors finally breached the cathedral walls they found humans standing in ordered rows rather than fleeing in panic. And if the ancient Xenos felt anything at all about this display of defiance, it did not show in the cold calculations that selected targets and deployed Gauss weaponry with emotionless efficiency. The tech priests fought with the desperate fury of men who had devoted their lives to understanding machines and now confronted technology that mocked everything they believed sacred, that violated the principles of the omnicia by existing at all, mechanisms that functioned without power sources, that regenerated without forged templates, that demonstrated intelligence without machine spirits. Venko stood in a laboratory surrounded by captured Necron components, his mechadendrites interfacing with materials that burned his augmented senses, circuitry that operated on principles human science lacked language to describe, and he laughed with the manic edge of a man whose faith was shattering in real time because he could not comprehend how these abominations worked, yet they worked anyway, reality bending around them to accommodate functions that should be impossible. He tried to scrap code them, to corrupt their programming with hymns of malfunction, but the Necron technology didn't respond to code at all, didn't possess anything recognizable as software, just crystalline matrices that stored information in quantum states that existed in superposition across multiple dimensions simultaneously, and when he pushed too hard, the components simply dissolved his mechadendrites at the point of contact, his augmetic limbs unraveling into component molecules that hung in the air like metallic mist before scattering. The children died first in most places, not because the Necrons targeted them specifically, but because the Xenos' weapons didn't discriminate and children's bodies lacked even the minimal mass to absorb partial Gauss strikes that might leave an adult with seconds to scream before dissolution. Elia, the governor's daughter, hid in a closet while the skeletal figures she had seen in nightmares walked through her home killing servants and guards, their footsteps precise as metronome beats, and she understood with a terrible clarity children sometimes possessed that these were not monsters in the sense that orcs or demons were monsters. These were something far worse. They were legitimate. They had every right to be here. And she and her father and everyone she loved were the real intruders, squatters in a house whose true owners had finally returned, and that realization hurt worse than any physical pain could because it meant there was no justice in what was happening. No moral framework where humanity were victims rather than accidental trespassers. Just the cold mathematics of property reclamation executed with the efficiency of a civilization that had moved beyond concepts like mercy or cruelty into pure function. The northern farmlands burned with green fire that consumed organic matter but left stone and metal pristine, walls standing intact while the people who had sheltered behind them reduced to phosphorescent ash, crops withering to nothing in expanding circles that turned fertile fields into gray deserts overnight. Old Karn, who had felt the first tremors, stood in what had been his family's land for 5 generations and watched the thresher he had maintained for 40 years dissolve under a Gauss barrage, its metal frame unraveling into atomic vapor, and he thought with strange detachment that the Necrons weren't even fighting them. Not really. They were cleaning, sweeping away the biological contamination that had infested their property. And humans were just bacteria to be sterilized, not worthy of hatred or even acknowledgement, just refused to be eliminated with the same emotional investment a man brings to washing his hands. He stood there thinking these thoughts until the green lightning found him too, and his last sensation was not pain but a peculiar sense of relief that the waiting was finally over, that the tension that had been building for weeks had finally broken, and then he was nothing, atoms scattering on winds that carried the smell of ozone and extinction across fields that would never know human cultivation again. Castellan Dreveros made her stand in the ruins of Sancta Majoris with the grim satisfaction of a woman who knew she was writing the final chapter of her life and was determined to make it a chapter worth remembering. Her forces had collapsed from 30,000 to fewer than 3,000 in the space of 8 hours, defensive lines evaporating under Necron assault with the inevitability of morning mist under the sun. But those who remained were the hardest core, troopers who had stared into the green-lit eyes of extinction and decided that if death was certain then at least it would be death bought at the highest possible price. She positioned her remaining armor in kill zones designed not to stop the enemy but to channel them into narrow approaches where massed fire could achieve brief local superiority, moments where sheer volume of lost bolts and shell impacts could overwhelm even Necron regeneration, buying seconds of ground at the cost of lives measured in dozens, a mathematics of desperation that reduced warfare to its most primitive essence. They fought with everything they had and things they improvised when everything ran out. When lost cells depleted, they used bayonets and combat knives against necrodermis armor that turned their blades aside like rain on stone. When those broke, they used fists and teeth, and one memorable trooper who grabbed a Necron warrior and simply held on while his squadmates hammered it with rifle butts until something critical broke and it phased out. The trooper's victory scream cutting short as Gauss. Fire from another warrior reduced him to glowing particulate. They wired buildings with improvised explosives and brought them down on advancing formations, thousands of tons of rubble achieving what their weapons could not by simple mass, burying Necron warriors under debris that required minutes to dig free from, and in those minutes human soldiers poured concentrated fire into the trapped Xenos, occasionally achieving genuine kills when they hit something critical before the self-repair could compensate. Small victories that tasted like water in a desert, insufficient but desperately needed proof that the enemy could bleed even if their blood was liquid metal and nanomachine swarms. The civilians fought too, because when the choice is between dying passive or dying defiant, then humanity will choose defiance with a stubborn logic that is both the species' greatest strength and most persistent flaw. They fashioned weapons from farming tools and industrial equipment, one group rigging a mining drill to a cargo hauler and driving it straight into a Necron phalanx, the drill bit shattering on necrodermis armor, but the hauler's mass and velocity sufficient to knock warriors aside, creating a momentary gap that fleeing refugees exploited before Gauss weaponry caught the hauler and unrolled its atomic structure, driver and all. An old woman who had lived 90 years without seeing violence personally threw acid from her chemical synthesis lab, industrial compounds meant for fertilizer production that proved marginally effective at compromising living metal self-repair when applied in sufficient volume. Her last contribution to humanity's defense before Gauss lightning found her, and she vanished in a flash of green that left only the echo of her defiant shriek. Tech priest Venko abandoned orthodox Mechanicus doctrine in favor of raw survival pragmatism. Jury-rigging captured Necron power cells to Imperial weapons in configurations that made his augmented nervous system scream warnings about abominable intelligence and tech heresy, but he soldered connections anyway because doctrine was luxury and they needed every advantage no matter how ideologically impure. The hybrid weapons functioned for brief periods before overloading catastrophically, lost guns fed by Necron power sources burning through their barrels after a dozen shots, but those dozen shots hit with energies that could actually damage necrodermis, punching through armor that standard lost bolts just splashed against, and for a few precious minutes the human defenders achieved something approaching parity, downing Necron warriors faster than they could phase out for repair. But the Necrons adapted, their ancient intelligence recognizing the threat and adjusting tactics with the fluid precision of water finding new channels, and the advantage vanished as the Xenos simply stopped advancing in patterns that allowed the captured power cells to be deployed effectively, their coordination indicating some form of networked intelligence that processed tactical data and disseminated updates across the entire force in real time. Father Dominicus led his flock not in prayer now but in combat, the priest having shed his robes for flak armor and lost carbine, his faith expressing itself not in words but in the fury with which he pulled the trigger, each shot accompanied by whispered benedictions that were half prayer and half curse, beseeching the Emperor for strength while simultaneously raging at the divine for abandoning them to this fate. His followers fought beside him, men and women who had spent lives in devotion, finding that when push came to ultimate shove they possessed reserves of violence they had never suspected, the capacity for hatred burning through religious conditioning to reveal the animal beneath, the beast that had climbed from Terra's evolutionary crucible with teeth and claws, and the absolute refusal to die quietly. They held the cathedral for 3 hours against Necron assaults that should have overrun them in minutes, their determination creating localized miracle through sheer bloody-minded obstinacy. But determination alone cannot stop Gauss weaponry, and when the Xenos finally breached the inner sanctum they found Father Dominicus standing before the altar with lost gun empty and arms spread as if to embrace them. His final words a litany of defiance that died mid-sentence as green lightning erased him from existence, his faith armor against fear but not protection against the physics of molecular disintegration. Governor Cormand died in his spire, barricaded in his office with a few guards who remained loyal when the others fled or turned on him in rage at his delays and false promises, and he died with a nobleman's privilege of knowing exactly how much his decisions had cost. The intelligence reports he had buried coming back to haunt him as he watched through shattered windows his world ending in green fire and black monuments that rose like accusations from the tortured earth. He thought about legacy and how history would remember him, if history remembered him at all, if anyone survived to write histories, or if Veldara Prime would simply vanish from Imperial records as another colony lost to the innumerable threats of a hostile galaxy. His last act was to shoot himself with a lost pistol rather than face the Necron warriors that breached his door, a coward's exit but one he took with eyes open, and if that constituted redemption or damnation, He neither knew nor cared in those final microseconds when the lost beam boiled his brain and spared him the sight of skeletal figures that stepped through his door with the casual indifference of janitors entering a room they meant to clean. The spaceports became charnel houses as desperate crowds tried to board ships that were already gone, the few captains with functioning vessels having fled orbit hours earlier when the scope of the disaster became clear, leaving behind thousands who tore at locked boarding ramps with bare hands until Necron forces arrived and the screaming stopped in waves of green lightning that swept across the landing fields like a scythe through wheat. One freighter captain, a woman named Jex who had hauled grain off Veldara Prime for 20 years, made the calculation that her ship could carry maybe 300 refugees if she stripped the cargo bays and had them pack in like livestock, and she opened her cargo ramps accepting whoever could fight their way aboard. Her crew beating back the overflow with shock mauls because letting more aboard would doom everyone when the ship's life support and inertial compensators exceeded safe capacity. She lifted off with people still clinging to her hull, their fingers locked on maintenance ladders and airlock seals, and she felt them die as her ship breached atmosphere and the cold of the void froze them solid, their bodies remaining attached until orbital velocity and random debris impacts knocked them loose, frozen corpses tumbling back toward a planet that no longer had any use for organic remains. The Adeptus Astartes precinct fortress became the last true strongpoint, its walls built to Imperial military specification rather than civilian standards, meters of rockcrete and plasteel designed to withstand siege conditions. And within its walls, arbitrator martial coves organized the defense that would be taught in Schola Progenium classes for generations to come as an example of how far discipline and proper fortification can push back the inevitable. His Arbites fought with the cold precision their training demanded, no wasted motion or ammunition, each shot calculated and delivered with marksman accuracy to joints and damage points that intelligence indicated might compromise Necron motor function, and for a time they achieved something remarkable, holding a position that by all tactical assessment should have fallen in minutes, their coordinated fire and overlapping fields of effect creating a killing ground that even the Xenos could not cross without taking casualties that exceeded their local repair capacity. But the Necrons adapted again, because that is what they do, what 60 million years of warfare and technological evolution had refined them to do, the ability to analyze and counter any threat given sufficient data, and the data from the Arbites' defense was analyzed and solutions implemented within hours. The Xenos simply bypassed the fortress, phasing their forces through the quantum barriers between dimensions to rematerialize inside the walls, negating the fortifications entirely through technology that made mockery of human concepts of solid defense. Coves found himself fighting inside his own command center, his Arbites dying at their posts as Necron warriors appeared from thin air like nightmares solidifying from smoke, and he understood in those final moments that this was not a battle between armies but a demonstration of technological supremacy. The Necrons making clear that nothing humanity built could protect them when the ancient Xenos decided to reclaim their property. No wall thick enough, no armor strong enough, no faith deep enough to matter against the simple reality of a civilization that had solved death itself and now wielded immortality as a weapon against those who still feared extinction. The last organized resistance occurred at the southern mining complex where the drilling team had first breached the tomb, a cruel irony that the site of humanity's first glimpse into the crypt would become the location of their final stand. A mixed force of miners, PDF deserters, and civilian volunteers held the complex using the industrial equipment as improvised weapons, fusion cutters and industrial presses and/or processing machinery all repurposed to kill in ways their designers never intended. They fought in the tunnels and shafts with the advantage of knowing every corridor and junction, collapsing passages behind them to slow pursuit, flooding chambers with toxic industrial runoff, venting atmospheric processors to create vacuum zones that they could traverse with emergency respirators while Necron warriors phased out to escape the environment damage. Temporary victories that bought hours at most, but hours where humans remained free and fighting rather than reduced to glowing ash. Their leader was the drill team operator Gregors, the man who had first seen the tomb and now found himself commanding humanity's last pocket of resistance on Veldara Prime, a position he had never trained for and did not want, but which he filled with the stubborn competence of a man who had spent his life solving practical problems in hostile environments. He knew they could not win, knew that even their survival measured in hours was optimistic, but he also knew that every hour they held was an hour where humans could claim this world was still contested, still fought for, And maybe somewhere in orbit a survivor would be looking down and seeing that last pocket of resistance and understanding that humanity had not gone gentle, had not surrendered without extracting maximum cost, had made the Necrons work for every meter of ground even when the outcome was never in doubt. When the tomb finally responded by simply collapsing the entire complex, bringing thousands of tons of stone down on defenders and attackers alike, Gregors died with his hands still gripping the controls of a mining drill he had driven straight into a Necron lord's torso, both of them buried together under rubble that would serve as grave marker for the last humans to die fighting on Veldara Prime rather than fleeing or cowering. The true awakening began when the Phaeron rose, not from the depths like the lesser warriors, but from stasis crypts that existed partially outside normal space-time, dimensional pockets where the tomb's greatest treasures had slept in suspension that insulated them from the ravages of 60 million years. The Phaeron emerged from light that hurt to perceive, green radiance that carried information as well as illumination, his form ancient beyond any organic comprehension yet perfectly maintained, every joint and servo optimized by technologies that humanity would not discover in 10,000 generations of progress. He stood in the heart of the primary pyramid as it breached Veldara Prime's surface, the structure rising from the planet's mantle where it had rested since before Terra's continents achieved their current configuration, black stone surfaces etched with dynastic glyphs that proclaimed his names and titles in languages that predated the evolution of human vocal cords. And around him the remaining lesser lords of his dynasty materialized from their own stasis, a court of skeletal immortals, gathering to witness their master's reclamation of a world that had always been his by right of ancient conquest. The Phaeron did not speak, for Necrons of his status had long ago transcended the need for verbal communication, but his will radiated outward as quantum-encoded commands that every lesser Necron on the planet received simultaneously, a network of intelligence that operated at speeds no organic brain could match. The slaughter of humans ceased not from mercy but from irrelevance, the local resistance eliminated to the point where the remaining survivors posed no threat to the reclamation efforts, and the Xenos warriors turned to new tasks, the construction and reactivation of infrastructure that had slept beneath Veldara Prime's surface, machinery that began to hum with energies drawn from stellar cores the Necrons had harvested and stored in pocket dimensions during the war in heaven, power sources that made Imperial plasma reactors look like children's toys. The monuments rose, structures that had always existed but phased into visibility as Necron technology rewrote local reality parameters, pyramids and obelisks that scraped ionosphere and monoliths that pulsed with gravitational lensing that bent starlight into artistic patterns visible from orbit. These were not military installations but cultural ones, architecture meant to proclaim dynastic glory and artistic vision, the Necrons rebuilding not a fortress world but a monument to their own magnificence, a statement to the galaxy that they had returned and would restore the empire that organic upstart races had squatted in during their long sleep. The black stone was carved with friezes depicting the dynasty's history, battles fought against gods and monsters, victories won when the stars themselves were young, and subjugation of lesser species who had dared challenge the Necronter supremacy, images that included early humanity among the defeated, stone carvings 60 million years old showing ape-like primitives kneeling before Necron lords. A casual reminder that even before humanity achieved civilization they had existed only at Necron sufferance. The surviving humans, those few thousand who had fled into the wilderness or hidden in remote locations the Necrons deemed insufficient priority to immediately cleanse, watched from hiding as their world transformed around them. They saw forests wither and die as Necron machinery extracted minerals from soil that had taken millions of years to develop, leaving behind gray desert that would never support organic life again. They watched rivers rerouted and mountains leveled, the planet's geography rewritten to match ancient charts that the Necrons had preserved from when this world was a garden of their empire, before tectonic drift and evolutionary processes had altered its surface. The survivors huddled in caves and ruins, eating vermin and drinking fouled water, their civilization reduced to Stone Age survival conditions on a world that was being actively hostile to their continued existence, not through deliberate action but through the simple fact that the Necrons were terraforming back to specifications that had no place for oxygen-breathing organics. Among the refugees was Elia, the governor's daughter, who had escaped the spire collapse that killed her father by pure luck of being in a maintenance tunnel when the structure came down. She had watched through cracks in rubble as Necron warriors walked past without noticing her, their sensors tuned to detect active threats rather than terrified children, and she had crawled through debris for hours until reaching the surface to find a world she no longer recognized. The other survivors she encountered were broken things, humans who had watched their families dissolve into green-lit ash, who had seen their entire civilization erased in hours, and they looked at her with eyes that held no hope because hope was luxury that required belief in a future, and none of them believed in futures anymore. They survived because biology demanded they continue metabolism, but it was survival without purpose, simply waiting for the Necrons to eventually notice them and complete the extermination they had paused for more important tasks. The Phaeron stood atop his primary pyramid and gazed across a world that was becoming his again, ancient possession restored after what was for him merely a long nap, and if he felt anything about the brief organic infestation his planet had endured during his sleep, it did not register in his consciousness as significant. Humans to him were not enemies or even prey. They were simply errors in the natural order, biological contamination that had colonized a sterile surface during his absence and which would be efficiently sterilized now that he had returned. His court assembled around him, lords who had fought in wars that burned galaxies and shattered gods, and they looked upon Veldara Prime with satisfaction that their dynasty's property was being restored, that the insult of organic squatters would be erased, and that they could resume the great work that had been interrupted by the war in heaven, the construction of an empire that would endure until the last star burned cold. But beneath the triumph of reclamation there stirred something the Phaeron had not anticipated, a wrongness in the fabric of reality that even his ancient sensors struggled to quantify. The Imperium, that roiling hell dimension that Necrons had always despised for its chaos and irrationality, had grown during their sleep, metastasizing like cancer through the galaxy's spiritual substrate, and worse, the organic species now infesting the galaxy fed it with their emotions and beliefs, their psychic emanations strengthening the warp in ways that created complications the Necronter had never faced during their wars against the Old Ones. The human souls that had died on Veldara Prime, millions of them extinguished in hours, had left psychic echoes that resonated in frequencies the Necrons found deeply troubling, impressions of fear and rage and desperate faith that lingered like radiation, and the Phaeron understood with growing concern that the galaxy had changed in ways that purely material solutions might not adequately address. He commanded his cryptex to analyze the phenomenon, and they brought him findings that would have disturbed him had he retained the emotional capacity for disturbance. The humans who had died here had believed in something called the God Emperor, a psychic entity that might or might not actually exist, but whose believers numbered in the quadrillions across the galaxy, and their collective faith had weight in the Imperium, created a presence that pushed back against Necron technology in ways that should not be possible because the Necrons had designed their entire civilization to function independent of the warp, to operate on purely material principles that chaos could not corrupt. Yet here on Veldara Prime, the psychic echoes of dying humans seemed to slow the reactivation of certain systems, not through any direct action but simply by existing in proximity, their faith creating localized turbulence in the Imperium that bled over into real space and caused quantum effects in Necron machinery that should have been immune to such influence. It was a minor inconvenience at worst, delays measured in hours rather than days, easily compensated by deploying additional resources, but it was also troubling as proof that the galaxy they had awakened into was not the galaxy they had left. The great enemy of the Necronter had always been entropy and time, the slow decay of reality toward heat death, and they had solved that through biotransference, transforming themselves from fragile flesh into eternal metal, but the organic races had found different solution. They had weaponized belief itself, created gods from consensus reality that had actual power in dimensions the Necrons could not entirely control. The Phaeron contemplated this development with the cold calculation of a strategic thinker who had outlived stars and knew that victories were not about immediate battles but long-term positioning, and he understood that reclaiming the galaxy would require adapting to these new conditions, developing counters to psychic phenomena that the ancient Necronter had never needed to face. Meanwhile, in the hidden spaces where human survivors clustered, strange things occurred that none of them could explain, but which some chose to interpret as miracles because the human mind craves pattern and meaning even in chaos. A girl who should have died from infected wounds found them mysteriously healed when she prayed before an improvised shrine built from debris shaped into crude aquila. A group trapped in a sealed chamber without water discovered a crack in the wall weeping moisture that analysis would have shown came from entirely normal geological processes, but which they chose to see as divine providence because the alternative was admitting they survived through pure chance in a universe that cared nothing for their continued existence. These were not genuine miracles in any objective sense, just statistical anomalies that conscious beings interpreted through the lens of faith, but the faith itself was real. And in the warp where belief had weight and consciousness shaped reality, that faith created ripples that something vast and distant might have noticed, or might not have, the nature of the God Emperor being perhaps the greatest theological debate in the Imperium, and one that would never be definitively resolved. Elia, who had been raised in comfortable atheism dressed as obligatory devotion, found herself praying with genuine fervor born of desperation, her childhood catechisms taking on new meaning when the alternative was accepting that she huddled in darkness on a world that wanted her dead, while monuments to alien gods rose around her proclaiming humanity's absolute irrelevance. She whispered prayers to the Emperor and tried to feel his presence, tried to believe that somewhere in the vast galaxy her suffering mattered to something greater than random chance, and whether anything actually heard her or whether the comfort she felt was just her own mind protecting itself from despair was question she lacked the theological training to answer, but the comfort itself was real enough to keep her alive another day. And in the mathematics of survival, another day was victory. However small and temporary. The Necron reconstruction continued with the inexorable efficiency of a civilization that had spent millions of years perfecting the art of large-scale engineering, automated systems deploying from pocket dimensions where they had waited in stasis, scarabs swarming in their billions to break down organic matter and rearrange it at the atomic level into building materials, and slowly, steadily, Veldara Prime's surface began to resemble the ancient charts, the world reverting to configuration it had held before continental drift and biological evolution had altered it. The Phaeron watched this transformation with satisfaction that was more aesthetic than emotional, appreciating the artistry of restoring something to its proper state, and if he considered the human survivors at all, it was only to calculate when they would die from environmental factors without requiring active extermination, a timeline he estimated at perhaps 30 local solar rotations before dehydration and starvation completed what his warriors had begun, an acceptably efficient solution. That required no further resource allocation. The warp translation that brought the Crimson Fists to Veldara Prime occurred on the 43rd day after the Awakening, the Space Marines emerging from the Imperium with weapons hot and boarding torpedoes loaded, expecting to reinforce a world under siege and finding instead a tomb world fully awakened, its surface transformed beyond recognition. Captain Corvain stood on his battle barge's command throne and watched the tactical displays populate with contact markers that numbered in the hundreds of thousands, Necron signatures swarming across a planet that registered as 97% non-organic on bioscanners, and he understood immediately that this was not a reinforcement mission but a recovery operation at best, an evacuation of whatever humans remained alive on a world that had already fallen beyond salvation. He deployed his forces anyway because that is what Space Marines do. They fight regardless of odds or strategic calculus. And if Veldara Prime could not be saved, then at least the humans who still drew breath on its surface would know that the Emperor had not abandoned them, that his angels of death had come even if they came too late. The Thunderhawks screamed down through atmosphere that tasted wrong to their machine spirits, the air composition altered by Necron terraforming, oxygen levels dropping as the Xenos machinery optimized for their own preferences rather than human survival, and the pilots compensated while scanning for human life signs that appeared as scattered pockets in the wilderness regions. Refugees clustered in locations the Necrons had not yet bothered to cleanse. Brother Sergeant Typhon led the first extraction team, his tactical squad touching down in a forest that was dying from soil contamination, trees withering to gray husks as Necron scarabs stripped minerals from the ground, and he found 17 humans hiding in a cave system, their bodies emaciated and their eyes holding the haunted look of people who had stared into extinction and found it staring back. They cried when they saw him, tears of relief and disbelief that angels in ceramite had actually come, and he loaded them into the Thunderhawk with gentle efficiency while his squad provided perimeter security, bolters ready for Necron forces that did not come because the Xenos deemed this location insufficient priority to defend, the humans mere vermin not worth the ammunition to exterminate. The extraction operations continued across multiple sites, Crimson Fist's teams pulling survivors from hiding with the clinical efficiency of soldiers who had performed such operations on 100 worlds, and slowly the count rose, hundreds recovered and then thousands, nowhere near the millions who had died, but enough that the operation could be classified as something other than total failure. Among the rescued was Elia, found semi-conscious in a drainage tunnel with 4 other children who had banded together for survival, and when Brother Apothecary Savan lifted her onto the Thunderhawk, she looked into his helmet lenses and asked in a voice hoarse from dehydration if the Emperor had finally answered her prayers, and Savan, who had seen things that would break normal humans and remained stoic through it all, felt something twist in his transhuman heart at the naked hope in her. Question, and he told her yes. The Emperor hears all prayers even if his answers come in ways we do not expect, a theological flexibility that his chaplain would have questioned, but which seemed necessary when dealing with a child who had watched her world die. Captain Corvain did not order the withdrawal immediately because Space Marines do not flee without testing the enemy's strength, and he led 3 companies in a strike against the primary pyramid to assess Necron response capability and acquire tactical intelligence for future operations. His forces hit hard and fast, drop pods slamming into the pyramid surface to deploy Devastator squads that poured loss cannon and plasma fire into the structure, while assault marines equipped with melta-weapons targeted what appeared to be critical power junctions. For approximately 7 minutes they achieved local superiority, their shock assault overwhelming the immediate Necron defenders, and Corvain allowed himself brief hope that perhaps Space Marine supremacy could turn this tide, that the Emperor's finest might accomplish what the PDF could not. Then the pyramid responded not with defenders but with the structure itself, the black stone rippling and reconfiguring, Gauss flares emerging from walls that had appeared solid, and the Space Marines found themselves fighting architecture as much as warriors, the pyramid revealing itself as weapon platform on scales that dwarfed anything in Imperial arsenals. Devastator squads disappeared in emerald lightning that their armor barely slowed, the blessed ceramite of power armor proving only marginally more resistant than mortal flesh to weapons that operated at the molecular level. Corvain ordered immediate withdrawal when his tactical displays showed Necron forces converging from all vectors, not just warriors but constructs that his combat database classified as Canoptech wraiths and tomb spiders, war machines that moved with impossible speed and struck with force sufficient to shred Astartes' battleplate. The withdrawal cost him 47 battle brothers, nearly half his strike force, killed or missing presumed phased out to Necron holding facilities, and he retreated with the bitter taste of failure because Space Marines do not lose engagements except against enemies that outmatch them so completely that valor becomes irrelevant. The fleet action that followed proved even more one-sided, Captain Corvain's battle barge and its escort cruisers engaging Necron vessels that phased through void shields as if they were not present, that teleported boarding parties directly onto Imperial bridges using technology that made mockery of Geller field protections. The Crimson Fists fought void combat with the ferocity of cornered predators, their ship servitors chanting binary prayers while human crew operated weapons with a desperate precision of people who understood they faced extinction, but Necron vessels did not die the way Imperial ships died. They did not break apart or explode when their hulls were breached. They simply phased out when damage exceeded local repair capacity, withdrawing to safe distance before rematerializing with wounds. Already healing, living metal flowing like liquid to seal breaches that would have doomed any Imperial vessel. The engagement lasted 3 hours before Corvain accepted the mathematics and ordered retreat, his ships limping toward the Mandeville point while Necron forces pursued with the lazy confidence of hunters who knew their prey was already exhausted. They made it to warp translation through combination of skill and sacrifice, the escort cruiser St. Veronica remaining behind to buy time for the battle barge's escape, her captain ordering full power to engines while ramming course locked on the largest Necron pyramid ship, and her sacrifice was magnificent and ultimately futile, the Necron vessel simply phasing 90 degrees out of normal space-time to allow the Imperial cruiser to pass through the coordinates it had occupied without impact.